What the hell does it feel like to watch a family die right in front of you, even when they're still breathing? If you've ever wondered, stick around, because you're about to find out. This house was a goddamn tomb, polished and pristine, but dead all the same. And into that tomb walked a woman with nothing but a heartbeat in a world that had forgotten its own. This story will gut you. It will break you open. And then, just maybe, it will put you back together. If you're ready for that ride, and if you think stories like this matter, do me a favor right now and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because you are not going to want to miss a single second of what happens next. Every morning, the Thorne estate echoed with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. It was a silence carved from grief, maintained by routine, and polished by a staff who knew better than to make a sound. And into this mausoleum walked Amelia, a young woman with eyes that saw too much and a heart that refused to armor itself against the world. She'd been hired to care for two grieving twins who hadn't truly smiled since their mother, Isabella, was ripped from their lives. But on one suffocatingly ordinary morning, a single, reckless spoonful of mashed potatoes would change the goddamn world. A sound would erupt from the silence. Laughter. The twins, Leo and Miles, would giggle, and their father, the billionaire recluse Julian Thorne, would walk in at that exact moment, frozen, stunned. Who was this woman? This stranger who was tearing down walls he couldn't even find the door to? And what in God's name will happen when his own children ask her a question that no one, least of all him, ever expected? Can you be our mommy? Stay with us. The morning began just like every other one in the Thorne estate. Quiet, mechanical, utterly lifeless. Amelia moved through the colossal kitchen with a practiced efficiency that belied the knot in her stomach. She plated scrambled eggs and buttered toast onto 3 small, cold porcelain dishes. The twins, Leo and Miles, sat at the far end of a dining table long enough to host a state dinner, their identical blonde heads lowered, their blue eyes dull and utterly uninterested in the food placed before them. Amelia observed them for a moment, her hand still resting on the last plate. They looked like porcelain dolls, beautiful, fragile, and untouched by joy. She'd only been working there for 2 weeks, a lifetime in this house, but it was long enough to understand that their silence wasn't insolence. It was grief. And more than that, it was a deep, sucking emptiness that seemed to swallow every attempt she made at connection. She'd tried asking questions about their day. She'd tried singing silly songs off-key. She'd even brought in a sheet of sparkly dinosaur stickers once, an act of defiant optimism. Nothing had worked. But this morning, watching their small bodies slump forward as they listlessly poked at their eggs with silver forks, something inside her didn't just clench. It snapped. She didn't know what made her do it. A surge of impulse, a primal instinct, or sheer, unadulterated desperation. But she scooped a generous spoonful of mashed potatoes from the serving bowl in the center of the table, and with a flick of her wrist, lobbed it gently onto Miles's head. The white fluff landed with a soft plop, sliding down the side of his face like frosting on a forgotten cake. He froze. Leo gasped, a sharp intake of breath that shattered the room's stillness, and Amelia just stared, holding back a wild, inappropriate smile she was certain she wasn't allowed to feel. Miles didn't cry. He didn't scream. For one terrifying second, it looked like he might, and Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs with a sick panic. "I'm fired! I'm so fired!" But then he turned to look at her, wide-eyed, and let out the smallest, strangest sound she had ever heard, a hiccuping, choked laugh. It was raw and unfamiliar, like an old engine sputtering to life, something that had been buried deep and left for dead. Leo blinked at his brother, then looked at Amelia with a mixture of shock and dawning curiosity. He didn't wait for permission. In a split second, his own spoon became a catapult, launching a mound of jam-covered toast that sailed through the air and hit Amelia directly on the shoulder. It struck her with a wet splat, leaving a sticky purple smear across her crisp white blouse. Her mouth fell open in mock offense. "Oh," she said, her voice teasing but trembling slightly, unable to believe this was actually happening. "So that's how it's going to be, is it?" The boys looked at her, their eyes wide, waiting to be scolded, waiting for the game to be shut down like every other spark of life they'd tried to ignite in this cold, empty house. But when Amelia dipped her own fingers into the whipped butter and flicked it with deadly accuracy at both of them, something broke, something monumental. The twins shrieked with a delight so pure it was almost painful to hear. Laughter, real, unrestrained, gut-busting laughter bounced between them, ricocheting off the marble floors and coffered ceilings. Leo stood on his chair, a fistful of mashed potatoes in his hand, a tiny, joyous warlord. Miles ducked under the table, launching grapes like miniature missiles. Amelia didn't stop them. She joined them. For the first time since setting foot in that house, she let go of the rigid control, the careful tiptoeing around their pain. She smeared butter on her own nose, chased them with a banana peel held aloft like a sword, and laughed harder and more freely than she had in years. Upstairs, Julian Thorne was pulling on a tailored jacket, preparing for yet another board meeting he didn't give a damn about. His tie remained undone, a silk noose hanging around his neck, and he ignored the insistent buzzing of the phone on his mahogany desk. The only sound that pierced his self-imposed fog was a faint thump that traveled up through the floorboards. Something falling, maybe. Then a sharp squeal, followed by laughter. He paused, his hand frozen on his lapel. That sound didn't belong in his house, not anymore. He stepped into the hallway, his brows furrowed in a deep line of annoyance and confusion, and followed the faint, alien voices down the grand, curving staircase, his chest tightening with a familiar dread with each step. By the time he reached the dining room archway, the sounds had grown louder, fuller, more chaotic. He walked through the hall with the cold certainty of a man who expected to put an end to something, expected a mess, a scolding, perhaps a broken heirloom. But he did not expect this. At the threshold, Julian froze. The kitchen looked like a battlefield. Bits of toast were stuck to the damask wallpaper. A puddle of milk was spreading slowly across the Italian marble floor. Grapes rolled beneath the table like lost soldiers. And in the middle of it all stood Amelia, her hair wild, and escaping its neat bun, her cheeks flushed, laughing with the twins like they were her own. Leo had frosting on his nose. Miles was doubled over, breathless from laughing so hard he couldn't stand. For a moment, Julian thought he was hallucinating, dreaming a scene from a life that was no longer his. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. All he could do was watch as Miles, in a fit of giggles, collapsed into Amelia's arms, his tiny body shaking with joy. Leo crawled into her lap, still clutching a spoon like a treasured weapon. She wrapped her arms around both of them instinctively, wiping a glob of mashed potato from Miles's ear with the hem of her own sleeve. Her face turned toward the doorway without realizing it, and their eyes met. His jaw was clenched, not in anger, but in something deeper, something terrifyingly close to fear. Amelia's smile faltered for a breath, her body tensing as if she expected a thunderous reprimand. But Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on his sons. Their eyes lit from within, their mouths open in pure, unadulterated joy, their hearts so clearly, so completely safe in her arms. He hadn't seen them like this since before the funeral. Not once. His heart, long numbed by tragedy and work and systematic avoidance, cracked in his chest, a sharp, painful fissure. He had hired this woman to maintain order, to be a placeholder, not to resurrect joy. And yet, here she was, an intruder in his carefully constructed fortress of pain, but also, impossibly, a healer in his home. The contradiction of it staggered him. The moment was so powerful, so overwhelming, that Julian almost missed what came next. As Amelia adjusted her grip on Leo, Miles suddenly leaned toward her, his eyes glowing with a profound sincerity only a child can possess. "I wish you were our mommy," he said, his voice soft and utterly certain. Leo looked up and nodded furiously, burying his face in her shoulder as if to seal the sentiment. Amelia froze, her mouth opening, but no words came. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same suffocating stillness as before. It was reverent, sacred. Julian felt it too, a tremble of truth that cut through the room like a physical shockwave. He took a half step back, unsure if he was intruding on something holy or witnessing something he wasn't ready to accept. Amelia didn't respond with words. She simply kissed the top of each boy's head and closed her eyes for a moment, and Julian, standing there, felt like he was watching someone take his place. And yet, instead of the sharp sting of jealousy he expected, what washed over him was a wave of inexplicable relief. The weight of it all, the months of silence, the failed attempts, the crushing guilt, hit him like a physical blow. He had spent months drowning in sorrow, building impenetrable walls around his children to protect them from more loss. But all he had done was isolate them, shut down their laughter, their hope, their very childhoods. Amelia had done the unthinkable, not by force, not through rules or therapy or bribes, but with warmth, spontaneity, and a single goddamn spoonful of mashed potatoes. He saw it now with blinding clarity. She hadn't broken the rules. She had broken the silence. And in doing so, she had given his boys back a piece of their stolen souls. Julian turned away, his throat tight, his eyes burning. He walked back through the hallway, leaving footprints in spilled milk. Back in the kitchen, the laughter slowly resumed. And though he didn't join them, he didn't stop it either. For the first time in a long, long time, he let it happen. Amelia stood in the middle of the war-torn kitchen, barefoot on tiles, slick with spilled milk and grape skins, wiping her forearm with a dish towel already soaked in syrup. Leo and Miles were still giggling beside her, the explosive joy now simmering down into a calmer, residual happiness that bubbled out in bursts of whispers and private jokes between them. She tried to muster a stern expression as she dabbed the last of the mashed potatoes from Miles's ear, but every time one of them cracked a new laugh, her lips betrayed her with a smile she couldn't suppress. "You two are absolute troublemakers," she said, shaking her head. "Your dad is going to take one look at this and fire me on the spot." Miles grinned with that innocent, unshakable defiance only a 5-year-old can muster. "But you started it," he countered, and Leo nodded in solemn agreement, sticking out his tongue for emphasis. Amelia sighed, a sound that was equal parts amused and exhausted, as she handed them each a wet paper towel. "All right, little soldiers, you helped make the mess. Now you help clean it." The boys obeyed without a single complaint, still giggling as they chased stray grapes under the table with their towels. For Amelia, it wasn't just about cleaning up the food. It was about preserving the fragile magic of that moment, stretching it for as long as she could before the oppressive heaviness of the house reclaimed them. But somewhere upstairs, she knew Julian had seen everything. She didn't know what he was thinking. and that terrifying uncertainty made her chest tighten just a little. Upstairs, Julian sat behind his massive desk in his office, elbows planted on the dark, polished wood, his fingers steepled against his mouth. His laptop was open, but the screen had gone black from inactivity. He wasn't working. He couldn't. The scene he'd just witnessed kept playing on a relentless loop inside his head. Amelia laughing, Miles squealing, Leo jumping on his chair with whipped cream in his hair. But what struck him hardest, what echoed in the hollow chambers of his mind, wasn't the chaos. It was the sound. Their laughter. It was too pure to ignore, too real to rationalize away. He hadn't heard that sound since Isabella was alive, since she used to spin the boys around in the garden until they were dizzy or sing them silly lullabies in the bathtub. It wasn't just noise, it was evidence, undeniable proof that his sons were still capable of joy, that the silence that had entombed their lives wasn't irreversible, and it hadn't come from him. That truth pressed against his chest like a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. He leaned back in his leather chair, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for months. How had she done it? Amelia, a woman he'd barely interviewed, someone he'd hired out of sheer, bone-weary desperation because every other highly qualified nanny had quit within a month. And yet, in 2 weeks, she had shattered a silence he thought would last forever, a silence he had allowed to grow, to fester. He didn't know whether to thank her or resent her for succeeding so profoundly where he had so utterly failed. Throughout the house, the staff began to whisper. Whispers always moved fast in a place like the Thorne estate, where everything was polished on the surface but frayed and tense beneath. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman who'd seen it all, had already noticed the shift. How the boys clung to Amelia's skirt hem, how they followed her with their eyes like lost puppies who'd finally found their person. "Did you hear what little Miles said to her?" she murmured to one of the kitchen staff as they scrubbed the last of the jam from the walls. "He called her Mommy." And it wasn't mockery in her voice. It was awe. Awe that someone had finally stepped into that icy, grief-stricken house and breathed warmth back into it. The gardener noticed, too, when the twins ran outside barefoot for the first time since Isabella's funeral, chasing Amelia through the manicured hedges while she held their shoes in her hands, laughing. It wasn't just that the boys were changing. The house itself felt different, less like a sterile museum, and more, impossibly, like a home. But Julian remained distant. Polite, but quiet. He watched from behind windows, from doorways, from the far ends of long hallways, as Amelia lived and laughed and breathed life back into what used to be his world. It was becoming clear to everyone but him that he wasn't just watching her with detached curiosity. He was slowly, painstakingly, being undone by her. Julian tried to reason through his profound discomfort. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. He didn't envy her charm or her effortless ease. But there was a growing tension inside him, like a rope being pulled taut to its breaking point. Every time he saw Leo's hand slip so naturally into Amelia's, or heard Miles call for her in the middle of the night instead of him, something sharp and ugly twisted in his gut. He knew it was irrational. Amelia was helping, not replacing. But it felt like failure. It felt like an indictment of his own fatherhood. He was their father. He had poured millions into top-tier therapy, specialized tutors, private instructors, child psychologists with resumes as long as his arm. None of it had worked. And now here came Amelia. No advanced degrees, no fancy credentials, no master plan, just warmth and instinct and a goddamn spoonful of mashed potatoes. And it was working. That reality burned more than he wanted to admit. One afternoon, he found himself standing by the doorway of the playroom, watching her gently comb Leo's hair while Miles sat beside her, quietly humming a tune she'd taught him. She didn't notice him, or if she did, she pretended not to. He turned away before they could see the expression on his face. Not anger, not resentment. Just the stark, hollow look of a man who didn't know how to be a father in a house that had started to move on without him. Amelia, meanwhile, was acutely aware of the lines, even if the twins kept trying to erase them. She never encouraged the mommy comments, though they pierced her heart in ways she hadn't expected. She would gently remind them that she was Amelia, not their mother, and that their mother loved them very, very much. But the boys didn't seem to care about definitions or titles. They only cared that she was there, that she listened, that she laughed with them, not at them. One night Miles showed her a drawing he'd made, 4 stick figures holding hands. "This is me and Leo and you," he said, pointing with a chubby finger. "Daddy's not in the picture," she noted softly, her heart aching for the man upstairs. "He's always in his room," Miles replied, with the brutal matter-of-factness of a child. Amelia didn't know how to answer that. The boys never spoke ill of Julian, but their silence around him was heavy, respectful, but tinged with a child's fear of a parent's impenetrable grief. She wondered if Julian knew how much his absence hurt them, how much they still needed him, even if they didn't know how to say it. But that wasn't her place. Or was it? She didn't want to overreach, to overstep. But the weight of what she was carrying, these children's fierce affection, their bottomless grief, their fragile hope, was growing heavier every day, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend it was just a job. In his office, Julian remained still long after the house had quieted again. It was mid-afternoon, the time when the twins usually napped, and Amelia would read quietly in the hallway chair between their rooms. He could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of pages turning even from here, and it made him feel like a stranger in his own home. His sons were healing, and he was watching it happen from behind a wall of glass he had built himself. The guilt was sharper, more acidic than he expected. He hadn't meant to be absent. He had just been broken. And somewhere along the line, he had confused grief with distance, silence with strength. Now, he wasn't sure how to reach them without ruining the fragile peace Amelia had so carefully rebuilt. He didn't know how to re-enter their lives. But what haunted him more than his own inadequacy was the question he couldn't shake. Why? Why could Amelia reach his sons when he, their own father, couldn't? He sat with that question until the room grew dark, until the thoughts turned so heavy they felt like stones in his chest. Downstairs, Amelia was helping the twins wash up for dinner, her soft voice drifting up the staircase like a lullaby. Julian closed his eyes and let it wash over him, both a comfort and a curse. He felt grateful, and he felt utterly, completely lost. Amelia had been thinking about the garden since her first day at the estate. Through the tall, paned glass of the sunroom, she could see hints of it. Overgrown hedges that had lost their shape. Flower beds choked with weeds. A once pristine stone fountain now dry and covered in moss. No one ever mentioned it. When she'd asked Mrs. Gable about it, the older woman had just shrugged and said, "No one goes out there anymore." It was another ghost, another part of the house sealed off by grief. But that morning, after managing to get breakfast down without a food war, Amelia felt something stir in her. The twins had been calmer than usual, but also subdued, quieter than they'd been during the mashed potato chaos. She couldn't bear the thought of losing them to the silence again. She clapped her hands suddenly, making both boys jump. "Shoes on," she declared with an authority she didn't feel. "We're going on an adventure." Miles blinked. Where? Ooh, a secret garden, she replied, wiggling her eyebrows conspiratorially. Leo looked skeptical, his expression a miniature version of his father's, but he followed her to the mudroom anyway. 10 minutes later, the three of them stepped outside. The boys hesitated at first, blinking at the bright sunlight like it was an unfamiliar, hostile element. But as Amelia knelt down and pointed to a stubborn patch of wildflowers forcing their way through cracks in the stone path, something shifted in the air. "See?" she said quietly. "Even the flowers don't give up." They walked slowly at first, the boys staying close to her legs like unsure ducklings. But curiosity is a powerful force in children. Miles was the first to wander off, kneeling by a bush and shouting, "Look, Amelia! Ants!" Amelia rushed over, crouched beside him, and studied the tiny, determined trail of insects with exaggerated seriousness. Leo followed, reluctant but intrigued, as if afraid of what he might feel out here in this wild, forgotten place. She took their hands and led them farther down the overgrown path, encouraging them to touch the waxy leaves, smell the broken twigs, look closely at the small, bustling worlds they'd never noticed before. When a monarch butterfly fluttered past, she gasped theatrically. "Whoever catches it first gets to name it," she challenged. Miles took off running, giggling madly, and Leo, after one last uncertain glance at Amelia, ran after him. It was the first time she'd seen him move with any real, unburdened energy. They darted through the tall grass, nearly tripping over their own feet. Finally, Leo shouted, his voice filled with breathless triumph. "I got it. His name is Professor Fluffy." Amelia laughed so hard she nearly fell over. "Best butterfly name in history," she declared. The garden wasn't just a place anymore. It was becoming a canvas for sound, for silliness, for something lost that was slowly, tentatively coming back. The games shifted quickly. Children are always inventing new worlds. Soon they were valiant knights with sticks for swords. Worms were terrifying dragons, and a broken stone bench became their impenetrable castle. Amelia played along with boundless energy, roaring like a monster when they asked her to, pretending to faint dramatically when Leo poked her with a magic branch. But between every laugh and every tumble in the grass, she was watching them closely, noticing how Miles no longer looked over his shoulder as if expecting the fun to be abruptly ended. Noticing how Leo had stopped biting his nails and was now digging both hands into the cool, dark earth without a flicker of hesitation. These were not small victories. In the fragile world of a grieving child, these were monumental leaps. She gave them space to lead the play, to invent rules, and then gleefully abandon them, to be chaotic and loud and gloriously dirty. They needed this freedom. They needed to be messy. They needed to forget for a while what unspeakable pain had taught them to suppress. She sat on the cracked edge of the dry fountain, watching them argue over which bug was grosser, and she felt a lump rise in her throat. Joy like this wasn't cheap. It had to be earned. And watching them, she felt like she had earned at least a small piece of it. Back in the house, Julian had spent the morning reviewing contracts he didn't care about and speaking with lawyers he barely heard. But something was off. The house was too quiet. Not the heavy, oppressive silence he was used to. This one felt different, lighter. It wasn't until he passed the sunroom window and noticed the back doors were ajar that he realized where they must be. At first, he was irritated. He hadn't given permission for anyone to take the boys outside, into that place. But when he reached the glass and looked out, irritation gave way to confusion, then to something heavier, more complex. Amelia was spinning in a circle, her dress catching the wind slightly as she laughed. The twins circled her like two small planets around a brilliant sun. They were covered in dirt, their knees stained green, their fingers muddy. It should have looked like a disaster, a failure of supervision. But it didn't. It looked like life. Julian's jaw tightened as he watched. He wasn't angry, not really, but he couldn't ignore the sharp, painful stab inside him. That woman had woken something in his children that he hadn't been able to reach in months. And more than that, she had done it with nothing but her presence. No expensive toys, no structured therapy, just her. He stepped out onto the porch quietly, expecting them not to notice. The moment he did, he regretted it. His expensive leather shoes crunched lightly against the gravel path, and Leo looked up. Amelia followed his gaze and froze mid-spin. Miles turned around next, dropping his stick sword. The laughter ceased, not out of fear, but a sudden, jarring uncertainty. Julian took a slow breath, trying to keep his voice neutral. "What's going on out here?" Amelia started to speak, a practiced explanation ready on her lips, but it was Leo who surprised them both. "We're fighting worm dragons, Dad," he called, his voice breathless, his eyes shining. Julian's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard that voice, so alive, so unguarded in so long. Amelia cleared her throat. "We thought some sunshine might do them good." Julian didn't reply. He was staring at Leo now, the boy's blonde hair disheveled, his face smudged with dirt, grinning up at him with pure, unadulterated joy. Miles was beside him, laughing again, pointing at the imaginary worm monster and asking Amelia if she had any explosion powers. Julian wanted to say something, anything, but his words were caught in his throat. Something inside him cracked quietly, invisibly. It wasn't just the boys he was looking at. It was Amelia. And for the first time, he didn't envy her looks or her charm. He envied her ability to bring light where there had only been shadows. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Amelia gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if assuring him she understood, and perhaps she did. Julian took a step back, then another, retreating slowly toward the house. From the doorway, he paused and looked back one last time. Leo was laughing again, chasing Miles around the old fountain, yelling something about fairy dust. Amelia had dropped to her knees to tie a shoelace, her hands moving gently, naturally. And for a moment, Julian let go of his resistance and simply watched. The laughter returned, freer now, and Leo's face, bright with sunlight, flushed from play, lit by a real and impossibly rare joy, was the one that stopped him. A smile. Leo was smiling, not a polite, forced smile for a photo, not a fake one for a well-meaning relative. A true, full, uninhibited smile that reached his eyes. And Julian didn't move again. He stood there, caught between the man he had been and the father he desperately wanted to become, watching his son's face tilt up to the sky and break into that first, perfect, resurrected smile. The house was asleep, or at least it pretended to be. Amelia moved quietly through the upstairs corridor, barefoot, holding a glass of water she no longer wanted. She couldn't sleep. Not after the way Miles had cried during bedtime, a quiet, hiccuping grief that had no words. Not after Leo whispered, "Do you think Mommy sees us?" while she tucked the sheets under his chin. She hadn't known how to answer. Not really. It wasn't her place. And yet it had felt profoundly wrong to say nothing. She'd told him softly that some people believe love never truly disappears, that it just finds new ways to stay close. Leo had nodded, almost believing her, but the weight of their loss lingered in the room long after their eyes had shut. Amelia didn't return to her own small room. Instead, she wandered, drawn by something she couldn't name. That's when she found it. The double doors of the music room slightly ajar, as if issuing a silent invitation. She had passed that hallway dozens of times but had never dared to step inside. The room was rarely spoken of, another sacred sealed-off space. When she pushed the door open, the first thing she saw wasn't the grand piano, but the photograph atop it. Dusty, untouched, and heartbreakingly still. A woman with sunlight in her smile and a warmth in her eyes that even a faded photograph couldn't diminish. Isabella. Amelia didn't need to ask. She knew. She approached slowly, as though each step on the thick rug might trigger something sacred, something she had no right to disturb. Her fingertips hovered near the edge of the silver frame, careful not to leave a print. Isabella, she whispered, and saying the name aloud felt almost forbidden. She didn't know much, only the bare facts. Isabella Thorne had died in a car accident, and since then, Julian had changed. The staff never spoke ill of her. Instead, Amelia had caught hushed, reverent pieces of conversations. How Isabella used to fill the house with music, how the boys would dance in their pajamas to her piano playing, how she used to sing them to sleep. This room must have been alive once. Amelia could feel the echo of it in the still, heavy air. She stood in silence for a moment longer, unsure what to do, when her eyes fell on the piano itself. Its ivory keys were slightly yellowed, the polished surface coated with a fine layer of time. She stepped forward, sat down on the bench, and placed her hands gently on the keys. "I'm sorry," she said aloud, as though Isabella herself could hear. "I'm not here to replace anyone. I just don't want them to forget what joy sounds like." Her voice cracked on the last words, but her fingers didn't hesitate. She pressed the first note, a soft G, followed by a C, then an E, a simple, tender lullaby. The sound was delicate, fragile, like a whisper from another time. Amelia didn't know why her hands remembered this particular melody, an old tune her grandmother used to hum, one she hadn't thought of in years. But it came naturally, flowing from her like breath. She kept the volume low, respectful, as though she were asking permission with each note. She closed her eyes, picturing Miles's laugh, Leo's quiet smile in the garden, the way they clung to her during story time. She didn't want to wake them, but she wanted to fill the house with something other than silence, just for a little while. The keys responded warmly beneath her fingers, and slowly, the music gathered itself into something warmer, fuller. She didn't sing. Her voice, for now, stayed quiet, but her heart poured into every note. Behind her, the door creaked. She paused, her hands hovering over the keys, turning her head slightly. Julian stood in the doorway, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, tie loosened, his expression completely unreadable in the dim light. She straightened, lifting her hands from the keys, her body tensing as if she'd been caught trespassing on holy ground. But he didn't speak. He just stared at her, then at the photograph of his late wife. Something in his eyes shifted, softened. Not anger, not disapproval, just a profound weariness and something like surprise. Amelia stood up. "I'm so sorry," she said, her hands clasped in front of her. "I couldn't sleep." "You knew her name," Julian interrupted. It wasn't a question. Amelia nodded. "I didn't mean to pry, I see her in them. In Leo, especially." Julian walked further into the room, his steps slow and heavy. "This was her space," he said, nodding toward the piano. "She used to play every night. The boys would fall asleep right here on this carpet." He gave a weak, broken chuckle, then stopped. "I haven't touched it since." Amelia glanced at the keys. "You should," she said softly, Or maybe they should. They remember her voice. Maybe hearing music again, real music, could help. Julian shook his head, taking a half step back. "They're fine," he said. But even as he said it, his eyes darted toward the hallway as if checking to see if they'd heard. Amelia tilted her head. "They're surviving," she replied, her voice not accusatory, just painfully honest. "But they're not fine. There's a difference." He didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. She turned back to the piano and, almost as if asking his permission, laid her fingers across the keys again. This time she played even softer, a hum of something sad and sweet and slow. The notes trickled through the room like liquid memories. Julian stood frozen, caught between leaving and staying, between holding on and letting go. Then, from down the hallway, the soft padding of small footsteps. Leo appeared first, rubbing his eyes, his hair tousled from sleep. Is that Mommy's song?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. Amelia paused. Julian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Miles appeared next, clutching a stuffed lion, his thumb still in his mouth. "It's Amelia," he whispered. "She's playing Mommy's music." Amelia didn't stop playing. She shifted slightly on the bench, making room. The boys climbed up beside her, one on each side, their small bodies instinctively leaning into her warmth. Neither of them spoke. They just listened. Julian watched from a distance, his hands shoved in his pockets, his heart lodged in his throat. His sons, so often quiet and withdrawn, were sitting perfectly still, breathing evenly, their eyes fluttering shut. They weren't afraid. They weren't tense. They were peaceful. And in that moment, he understood something he hadn't wanted to admit. Amelia wasn't taking Isabella's place. She was reminding them that love could live in more than one form. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move. He simply stood there, letting the music take hold of the room, letting it wrap around him like a memory long buried but not forgotten. Amelia kept playing, her hands steady despite the storm of emotion in her chest. The boys leaned their heads against her arms, their breaths slowing, their small weight becoming heavier as sleep returned to claim them. Julian watched them, his sons, his memories, his pain, and something inside him began to shift. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Enough to see that Amelia wasn't a threat. She wasn't an intruder. She was a bridge between what was lost and what could still be salvaged, between the silence and the song. As the final lingering note rang out, Amelia didn't look back at him. She simply rested her hands on the keys, still and quiet, as both boys dozed peacefully beside her. Julian, still at the threshold, realized his feet hadn't moved in minutes. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't turn away. Not this time. He stayed, watching Amelia, watching his children. And for the first time since Isabella's death, he allowed himself to feel something more than just grief. He allowed himself to be present. In the weeks that followed the midnight piano lullaby, the rhythm of the Thorne household began to shift, subtly but undeniably. Amelia had never intended to become such a central, pivotal figure in the boys' lives, but every day their reliance on her, their open affection for her, deepened. And Julian noticed. God, he noticed everything. The way Miles reached up for Amelia's hand without thinking before climbing the stairs. How Leo waited at the top of the driveway every single morning just to see her car pull in. The small, intimate details haunted him. The way she threw her head back and laughed when she read stories aloud, doing all the voices. The way she whispered, "You're safe," into Leo's hair during his nightmares. The quiet, unspoken rituals she'd created that his boys now seemed to need as much as air. Julian caught himself waiting to hear her voice echo faintly through the long hallways. He'd pretend to be buried in contracts or emails in his study, but he was listening, watching, measuring how her vibrant presence filled the once hollow space that he himself had failed to occupy. And with every passing day, he wrestled with a question he couldn't shake. What did that make him? A bystander in his own home? Or a coward hiding behind his grief while someone else did the hard, messy work of healing his sons? Amelia didn't ask for more responsibility. She never stepped beyond her professional role, not overtly. But the children's profound affection for her became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as Julian returned early from a meeting, he saw her kneeling in the grand foyer, patiently tying Miles's shoelaces with a gentle care that made his chest ache. She looked up and smiled at him, warmly, briefly. Not flirtatious, just real, human. And it was that simple, unassuming humanity that pierced him most deeply. Later that evening, Leo refused to eat his dinner unless Amelia sat beside him. When Julian tried to engage him in conversation, the boy barely mumbled responses. But the moment Amelia entered the room, Leo leaned into her and began telling her an elaborate story he'd made up about superheroes who rescue lost puppies. Julian watched, feeling like a ghost at his own dining room table. He wasn't angry at Amelia. He was ashamed. Ashamed because one part of him was profoundly grateful, and another darker part resented her for being everything his children needed when he wasn't. That resentment took root, quiet and coiled, growing just under the surface, not because she did anything wrong, but because she was doing everything right. And it was working. The tipping point came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Amelia was in the boys' playroom, helping them build an elaborate blanket fort while the wind howled outside. Julian passed by the open doorway just as he heard Miles's voice rise above the laughter. "No, I said Mama Amelia sits here," he shouted, pointing to a specific, honored spot within the fort. Leo chimed in. "Yeah, she's the mom! You be the dad, Daddy!" Julian froze mid-step. The words hit him like a physical slap, cold and unexpected. He remained silent, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, listening as Amelia gently corrected them. "Boys, I'm not your mama. I'm just Amelia." But the twins laughed and insisted otherwise, calling her Mama Amelia again and again, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Julian didn't enter the room. He turned and walked away, his chest tight, his throat dry. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tormented by the truth he didn't want to face. His sons were starting to replace what they had lost. And he wasn't the one helping them do it. It was her. And though he knew it wasn't fair, the idea of someone else filling Isabella's sacred space twisted something sharp and bitter inside him. The next morning, the tension he'd been suppressing finally broke. He found Amelia in the sunroom, helping Leo build a solar system out of construction paper. Miles sat nearby, humming to himself. Julian's voice was sharper than he intended. "Can we talk?" Amelia looked up, immediately sensing the shift in his tone. She followed him into the hallway. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I think we need to clarify something," he began, his tone cold and corporate. "You're doing your job well, but let's remember what your job is. You're not their mother. You're their nanny. That's it." Amelia blinked, startled, as if he'd slapped her. Her voice stayed calm, but there was a sudden, unexpected steel behind it. "I have never claimed to be anything else, Mr. Thorne. Your sons are the ones calling me that. Maybe you should ask yourself why." Julian's jaw tightened. "They're confused. They're grieving." "Exactly," Amelia said, her gaze unwavering. And children in grief don't lie about who makes them feel safe. The hallway was silent for a beat, the air crackling between them. Her eyes didn't waver. She wasn't begging to stay. She wasn't defending herself out of guilt. She was simply standing in her truth. And that shook him more than any argument could have. Julian turned away, not because he'd won the exchange, but because he had no answer for it. He knew she was right, but hearing it spoken aloud forced him to confront a truth he had buried beneath routine and denial. His absence had created a void, and Amelia had filled it, not by choice, but because she showed up, because she listened, because she stayed. He stood in the hallway long after she had returned to the boys. He heard their laughter resume minutes later, muffled and distant, and he knew he'd just built a new wall, this one between himself and the one person who was healing his family. That night, he avoided dinner. He worked late, burying himself in meaningless tasks just to avoid another moment of feeling utterly irrelevant. But the echo of her words haunted him. Maybe you should ask yourself why. He repeated it to himself like a mantra, unable to escape the truth simmering underneath. Amelia wasn't replacing Isabella. She wasn't trying to be anyone's mother. She was simply being who she was, warm, grounded, safe. And his children had chosen her, not because she asked them to, but because they needed someone. And she had answered the call he had let go to voicemail. The next morning, everything appeared normal on the surface. Amelia prepared breakfast. The boys argued over which cereal was better. Julian sat at the head of the table, silent, distant, unreadable. Grace didn't speak to him unless it was absolutely necessary. But her energy hadn't changed with the boys. She still wiped Miles's chin, still laughed when Leo spilled milk. But something between them had cracked, an invisible fissure in the foundation of their fragile truce. Julian noticed it, and he hated himself for causing it. The truth burned in his chest. He'd lashed out, not because Amelia had overstepped, but because he hadn't stepped up. Because she had done what he hadn't been brave enough to do. Open her heart fully, despite the terrifying risk of loss. As he watched her gently fix Leo's collar, something inside him softened. His armor, thick and polished with guilt and grief, had begun to fracture. He didn't apologize. Not yet. But when Miles reached for Amelia's hand and called her Mama Amelia again, Julian didn't flinch. He looked at Amelia instead. And in her eyes, he saw no resentment, only a hurt held back with quiet grace. For the first time, he wondered what burdens she carried silently, what she sacrificed daily just to hold the broken pieces of his family together. And in that wondering, something finally gave way. The storm began shortly after sunset, and with it came a quiet, electric tension that wrapped around the house like a second skin. The air felt charged, not because of the weather, but because of everything left unsaid in the days prior. Amelia had kept her distance since the hallway confrontation. She remained warm and attentive as ever with the boys, but with Julian, she was distant, cordial, but without any of her previous softness. She hadn't retaliated, hadn't sulked, but her presence now carried a quiet restraint, like someone protecting a fresh bruise. And Julian felt her withdrawal like a physical ache. He hated it, not because it made her any less competent, but because it made her feel farther away than ever. That evening, he sat in his office with a glass of scotch untouched on his desk. Rain pattered violently against the tall windows. Lightning streaked the sky, and for a moment he watched it like a man staring at something he couldn't control. He didn't know how to undo what he'd said, or even if it could be undone. But guilt was no longer just a shadow in his chest. It was a storm, loud and alive and raging within him. Upstairs, the twins stirred. At first, it was just restless tossing, But then a loud, booming crack of thunder split the silence. And seconds later, Julian heard it. The unmistakable, piercing sound of Leo's scream. He was out of his chair instantly, moving toward the door, but Amelia had already beaten him to the hallway. He followed the sound of her rapid footsteps just in time to see her pushing open the boy's bedroom door. "I'm here, baby," she called softly, her voice steady and calm despite the chaos. "I'm here." By the time Julian reached the doorway, she was already at the side of Leo's bed, scooping the sobbing boy into her arms. Miles sat up, whimpering, clutching his pillow. "It was the car again," Leo sobbed into Amelia's chest. "I saw it crash. I saw Mommy." Julian froze in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe. Amelia cradled Leo tightly and reached her other hand toward Miles, who immediately crawled into her lap, burying his face against her side. "It was just a dream," she whispered, kissing both their heads, her voice a soothing balm. "You're safe. You're here. I've got you." She began to hum a soft, simple tune, the one from the piano room, a melody now familiar to them. The crying slowed, then softened into quiet, shuddering breaths. Julian stood frozen outside the door, feeling like an intruder in his own house, in his own children's lives. He wanted to move, to step forward, to say something, anything, but his feet wouldn't cooperate. Instead, he just watched. Amelia rocked gently, her arms wrapped around both of his sons, her body curved protectively around their trembling forms. She didn't look up at first, didn't acknowledge his presence. It was as if the world in that moment had shrunk to just her and the twins. Julian's chest tightened. There was no bitterness in her voice, no performance in her movements, only pure instinct, only care. He realized then, with a clarity that stung like acid, that his children didn't call for him when they were scared. They didn't reach for his hand in the dark. They reached for her. Not because she had taken something from him, but because he had never been there to give it. He had buried himself in grief, in business, in systematic avoidance. He had convinced himself he was being strong by keeping his distance. But strength didn't live in walls. It lived in moments like this, in sitting beside nightmares and whispering them away. And she had done that. Amelia had filled the space not by force, but by presence, by staying when he hadn't. After what felt like an eternity, Amelia looked up. Her eyes met Julian's across the room. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil, but there was no invitation in her gaze either. Only quiet recognition, a shared grief, a fragile peace offering. Julian stepped forward slowly, hesitant, unsure if he even had the right to be there. Amelia adjusted the boys gently, shifting Leo's weight in her arms while letting Miles curl deeper into her shoulder. Neither child stirred. "They've been having the dream more often," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They don't say it, but it's always the crash." Julian's face paled. He nodded, swallowing the thick lump in his throat. "I know." He knelt beside her on the rug, not too close, but near enough to show he was trying. Amelia looked down at the boys again, brushing Leo's hair back from his damp forehead. "Sometimes they just need to be held until the fear passes," she added. "You don't have to say anything. Just hold them." Julian absorbed her words like a man hearing instructions to a language he'd long forgotten. He didn't respond right away. He simply watched the steady rise and fall of their small chests, listened to the rhythmic hum of Amelia's comfort. The room felt smaller now, not because of its physical space, but because of the sheer weight of emotion within it. Julian realized he had spent so much time trying to fix everything, paying for therapists, remodeling rooms, buying distractions, that he had forgotten the most fundamental human solution. Presence. Just being there, just holding them through the storm. Amelia hadn't done anything miraculous. She hadn't rewired their trauma with some special technique. She had simply shown up over and over and over again until their hearts decided they were safe. Julian looked down at his sons, one in her arms, the other tucked into her shoulder, and something inside him broke. Not in a destructive way, but like a dam finally cracking open after holding back too much for too long. He saw what he had been so afraid to admit. His children didn't need a replacement for Isabella. They needed someone who saw them, who held them through the night. And Amelia, quiet, strong, patient Amelia, had done what he could not. Julian reached out a trembling hand and touched the edge of the blanket covering Miles. "I should have been here," he whispered, the words almost to himself, a raw confession. Amelia didn't respond. She didn't have to. She simply shifted slightly, making more space between them, not pushing him away, but letting him in. William sat beside her on the floor, closer now, watching the boys breathe in unison, calm again. The storm outside was still raging, but it felt irrelevant now. What mattered was inside this room. Amelia turned her head, and their eyes met once more. There was no hostility, no judgment, only shared exhaustion and a deep, unspoken understanding. William exhaled slowly, and for the first time in months, it didn't feel like the air caught in his chest. His voice, when it came, was raw. "Thank you." The words barely carried, but they hung in the air between them like something sacred. Amelia didn't nod, didn't speak. She simply held the boys a little tighter and looked at him with quiet acceptance. Julian leaned back against the wall, his hand resting lightly on Leo's leg, and let the silence settle. Not the suffocating silence of grief, but the healing kind, the kind that holds space for people who are trying. And in that stillness, with the rain tapping against the windows and two sleeping boys between them, Julian understood something profound. Sometimes love isn't loud. Sometimes it's a whisper in the dark. And sometimes it's just staying through the storm when everyone else has walked away. Are you still with us? I hope so, because what you've just witnessed is the breaking, the painful, necessary shattering of a man who thought he had nothing left. But what comes next? What comes next is the healing. And it's more beautiful and heartbreaking than you can imagine. If you're feeling this story in your bones, let us know in the comments. Your words mean the world to us. Now, back to the story. Amelia had seen the date circled on the kitchen calendar in the laundry room, faint pencil lines around the number 17. No name, no note, just a small, hesitant circle, like the ghost of something someone didn't want to forget, but couldn't bear to mention. She didn't need to ask what it meant. By then, she already knew. Isabella. The name hung in the house like dust motes in sunlight, never directly touched, but always present. In the week leading up to that day, Amelia noticed subtle, painful shifts. Julian's eyes grew more tired, his voice more clipped. The twins, too, became quieter again, less interested in their games, more prone to long, vacant stares that went far beyond their 5 years. No one said it was Isabella's birthday, but they didn't have to. Amelia felt it in the very air she breathed. On the morning of the 17th, Julian left early. No explanation. Just a short, strained goodbye to the boys and a muttered, "I'll be late." Amelia watched him go with a heavy heart, then looked at the twins sitting on the floor in their pajamas, playing with their toys without a shred of joy. She could have let the day pass silently, just like every year since the accident. But something in her, a fierce, protective instinct, rebelled against that notion. This wasn't a day to erase. It was a day to honor. She gathered the boys in the kitchen. Do you know what today is? She asked gently. Leo shrugged. Miles didn't answer. Amelia knelt down between them, bringing herself to their level. It's your mommy's birthday. That caught their attention. Their eyes widened slightly. But she's in heaven, Miles said quietly, his voice small. Amelia nodded. Yes, and that's exactly why we're going to make something special. A little cake, just for her. The boys looked unsure at first, but Amelia stood up with a sense of purpose and opened the pantry. Come on, you'll be my official head bakers. Soon, small hands were measuring flour, cracking eggs with more shell than yolk ending up in the bowl, and stealing chocolate chips when they thought she wasn't looking. Amelia didn't let them drift into sadness. She kept the mood light, laughing when Leo got frosting on his nose, cheering when Miles finally cracked an egg cleanly. But in between the jokes, she gently wove in memories. Did you know your mommy used to sing while she baked? She asked. And though they didn't remember, they smiled as if they could almost hear it. The warm, sweet smell of baking cake began to fill the kitchen, a scent of life in a house that had forgotten it. Amelia lit a single pink candle, soft and simple, and carried the small, round cake to the living room, placing it on the coffee table like a sacred offering. She sat the boys down on the plush rug and dimmed the lights just enough to let the candle's flame glow. Now, she said softly, we're going to make wishes for Mommy. Leo blinked. But she's not here. Wishes can fly, Amelia whispered. They don't need roads or airplanes, just hearts. She sat between them, each boy with one hand resting on the edge of the cake plate. Close your eyes, she guided. Think of something you'd want her to know. The boys obeyed. Miles's lips moved, a silent thought carried up like smoke. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, his small face frowning in deep concentration. Amelia closed hers too, though she didn't whisper a wish. She simply held space for theirs. After a beat, she opened her eyes and nodded. On 3. Let's blow together. 1, 2, 3. The flame went out in a single, unified breath. A puff of white smoke curled into the air, drifting toward the high ceiling as if on cue. The room was silent, but not heavy. Amelia had expected tears. Instead, she found a profound stillness. The boys leaned into her on either side, their faces soft, not sorrowful. They weren't crying. They were remembering, perhaps only from stories, perhaps only from dreams, but remembering nonetheless. And in that remembering, something gentle and beautiful had bloomed. It was in that precise, sacred moment that the front door clicked open. Julian stepped inside, soaked from the rain, the crushing weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. He expected darkness. He expected a quiet house and sleeping children. What he saw instead made him stop cold in the entryway. Across the room, his sons sat on the floor, their faces lit by the last dying glow of a candle's smoke. Amelia knelt between them, her arms gently wrapped around their backs. There was frosting on Leo's cheek, a chocolate smudge near Miles's collar. The small, simple cake still sat in front of them, its pink candle now extinguished. The scene was simple, quiet, and so devastatingly beautiful it stole the air from his lungs. Julian didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched, his eyes burning, as Leo leaned his head against Amelia's shoulder and whispered, "I hope she heard me." Amelia didn't respond with words. She simply kissed the top of his head and closed her eyes. Julian stood in the silence, the full impact of what he was seeing settling slowly, deeply into his bones. This wasn't a spectacle. This wasn't a performance. This was remembrance. This was healing. His hands began to tremble. He tried to steady them, but couldn't. For so long, He had avoided this day like it was a plague, convinced it would collapse him. He threw himself into work, took extra meetings, stayed late at the office, all to avoid facing the hollow, gaping ache that this date brought every single year. But here it was, centered in his own home, not ignored, not polished over, but gently, tenderly cradled in the hands of a woman he hadn't deserved. Amelia had done what he could not. She had acknowledged Isabella without making it about death. She had invited the boys to remember with love, not with fear. And more than anything, she had created a moment in which their grief didn't devour them. It united them. Julian took one step forward, then another, but still said nothing. Amelia finally noticed him, lifting her head, her eyes meeting his. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She didn't need to. Everything was already there in the silence between them. Gratitude, permission, peace. He stood there longer than he meant to, his eyes glistening, until finally, the tears he had buried for 3 long years found their way down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, quietly, fully. Amelia turned back to the boys and began humming a soft melody as they leaned into her, safe in a memory that felt real, even if only for a moment. Julian remained at a distance, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe, letting the moment wash over him. It hurt. God, it hurt. But for the first time, the pain wasn't unbearable. It was human. It was love, stretched across the veil of time. He looked at the little cake, at the burned-out candle, and something inside him fundamentally shifted. No grand speech, no dramatic declarations, just the quiet, earth-shattering realization that his family was beginning to breathe again, and that Amelia had lit the first match in a long, dark room. He stood still, a witness to something sacred, and though he didn't speak a word, the truth poured out of his silence like a prayer. His sons' faces glowed with something more powerful than grief. Not just remembrance, not just hope, but love. And Julian Thorne, for the first time on this date, allowed himself to feel all of it. It was late, nearly midnight, when Julian wandered into the twins' playroom, more out of restlessness than purpose. The room had become a gallery of their transformation. Crayon drawings taped to the walls, stuffed animals with missing buttons from too much love, and books left open mid-page like paused dreams. He wasn't expecting to stay long. He just needed a moment to breathe somewhere that didn't smell like whiskey and regret. That's when he saw it. A fresh sketch resting on the low white table where Leo often colored. The lines were uneven, childish, yet something about it made Julian's breath catch in his throat. 4 figures stood hand in hand, Leo, Miles, Amelia, and himself, and hovering just above them was a 5th figure, a woman with long, flowing hair and angel wings, her face drawn with painstaking care, a bright yellow halo above her smile. Isabella. There was no mistaking it. Julian sank to his knees, the paper trembling in his grip. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at the smiling version of himself in the drawing, the way Leo had drawn his own hand, reaching for Amelia's, and it felt like a mirror reflecting everything he had been too terrified to see. He found Amelia in the laundry room, folding towels in the quiet hum of the dryer, humming that same lullaby the boys liked before bed. She looked up, startled at first, seeing something raw and unguarded in his face. "Julian?" she asked, her voice low. He held up the drawing, his hands still trembling. "Leo drew this." She nodded slowly, her eyes reading the storm in his expression. He didn't speak at first. The quiet between them stretched, not awkward, but heavy, like something sacred hovered just out of reach. Finally, he broke it. He put her in the sky, he rasped, and he put you beside me, and I don't know how to feel about that. Amelia moved gently, stepping closer, placing the folded towel down as if it were fragile. Children draw what they feel, she said softly, not what they're told to feel. His jaw tightened. It feels like a betrayal, he whispered, the admission costing him everything. Like if I smile too much, if I breathe too deeply around you, I'm erasing her. Amelia didn't flinch. She took the drawing from his hand and looked at it quietly for a moment. Then, without asking, she stepped closer and pressed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. She's not in here, she said, her voice a soft, steady anchor. This is your heart. It's still beating. That means you're still alive. And love is not a betrayal. It's survival. Julian closed his eyes, but it was no escape. Her words crashed into him like waves against a dam he had spent years building, stone by painful stone. You think I haven't tried to move on? He asked hoarsely. I dated. I tried. But every time I felt like I was standing over her grave with someone else's hand in mine. And now, with you, it's different. It's not forced. I didn't plan for this. I didn't want it. But the boys... His voice broke, and he let out a bitter, humorless laugh. They called you Mama the other day, and I didn't correct them. I couldn't. Amelia blinked slowly, absorbing his confession without a hint of judgment. Do you think Isabella would want her boys to grow up in silence? She asked gently. To never laugh again? To never feel safe in a woman's arms? Julian didn't answer. He just stared at her, looking like a man on the edge of a cliff he wasn't sure he deserved to step back from. You're not replacing her, Julian. You're loving forward. There's a difference. He covered his face with one hand, the other still clutching the edge of the drawing. And then, for the first time, the wall didn't just crack. It shattered. A real, soul-deep break. Julian dropped his hand and let the tears come. They weren't quiet or graceful. They were raw, heavy, broken sobs pulled from a place he hadn't touched since the funeral. He sank onto the bench beside the washer, his shoulders shaking, his elbows on his knees. Amelia knelt in front of him slowly, her hands moving with the kind of tenderness that didn't demand anything in return. She didn't rush to speak. She simply placed both of her hands over his and waited. I miss her, he admitted, his voice barely audible through the sobs. I miss her so damn much. Amelia didn't say she understood, because how could she? But what she did say carried the weight of profound truth. You don't stop loving someone just because they're gone, she said. You just learn how to carry the love differently. He looked at her through wet lashes, and for the first time, he saw someone who didn't fear his grief. She had sat beside it, stepped into it willingly, without asking for anything in return. She wasn't trying to replace Isabella. She was trying to heal what Isabella's absence had shattered. Minutes passed before he spoke again. I've been afraid to live, he admitted, the words raw and honest. Afraid that if I started again, I'd be leaving her behind. Amelia tilted her head. But what if starting again is how you carry her forward? That silenced him. It wasn't a platitude. It was the truth. He thought of the birthday cake, of the candle, of the way the boys had whispered their wishes into the air as if someone might catch them. He thought of the garden, of the drawing, the way Isabella's angel wings hovered above them, not with sorrow, but with peace. Maybe she wasn't being erased. Maybe she was still here, just in a different form. Julian exhaled deeply, a sound like a man surfacing after nearly drowning. He looked at Amelia again. Really looked at her. She was tired, he realized. This wasn't easy for her either. But she had stayed. She had held the pieces of his broken family together when he couldn't even hold himself. "Thank you," he whispered. Not because he had to, but because the words had lived unspoken in his throat for far too long. Amelia smiled faintly, not triumphantly, just warmly, as if the pain, finally shared, weighed a little less. He didn't try to kiss her. He didn't make any grand declarations. He didn't reach for more than what the fragile moment could hold. But when she stood and reached down to help him up, he took her hand without hesitation. And that, perhaps more than anything, was what mattered. It wasn't romance. It wasn't a resolution. It was trust. Trust that she could hold his past without breaking under its weight. Trust that she could walk beside him without stepping into someone else's shadow. As he followed her out of the laundry room, his hand still in hers, Julian felt something loosen inside his chest. He wasn't healed. He might never be, fully. But tonight, he had taken one honest breath, one honest step, and that had to count for something. The drawing remained on the bench, left behind like a whispered prayer. A family of 4, beneath a smiling angel. Love, survival, memory. And the first quiet, undeniable proof that some walls, no matter how high, can come down, if only we let them. It began again where everything had once changed, in the kitchen. The air was warm with laughter, the kind that rang freely and without weight. Amelia stood between Leo and Miles at the island counter, each child gripping a butter knife smeared with frosting as they decorated messy cupcakes with the earnest focus only 5-year-olds could offer. Her cheeks were dappled with pink and blue icing, her smile completely unguarded. The twins giggled uncontrollably every time she pretended to be horrified at their uneven swirls or their sneaky licks of the frosting bowl. Julian stood in the doorway, unnoticed at first, just as he had been that first morning so long ago. But this time, there was no disbelief boiling inside him, no rage, no confusion. Only awe. He watched as Miles whispered something in Amelia's ear, and she gasped with dramatic flair, chasing him around the table with mock offense. Leo's laughter erupted, high and bright. The exact same space where silence and grief had once sat like twin ghosts now felt like the very pulse of a new beginning. And Julian, no longer content to be a bystander in his own life, stepped fully into the room, his heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the children. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached for a cupcake sitting beside Leo, letting the mess touch him for once. Frosting stuck to the cuff of his expensive shirt, and he didn't wipe it away. Amelia paused, sensing the shift. Their eyes met across the countertop, and something invisible, something profound passed between them, something heavier than a smile, but softer than a plea. "You're really bad at frosting?" she teased gently, trying to ease the sudden intensity. Julian gave a short laugh. "Yeah, I'm not sure cupcakes are my strength, but noticing what I've been blind to, maybe I'm finally getting better at that." Amelia's eyes didn't waver. "What do you mean?" Julian looked down at the half-decorated cupcake, then back up at her. "I mean, I've spent months walking through this house like a ghost, thinking I was the only one keeping it standing. But it was never me. It was you." Amelia blinked, the joke fading from her face. "Julian." But he didn't stop. "I see it now. You didn't just care for my kids. You brought them back to life. And you brought something back in me, too. I used to admire your kindness. I still do. But now I need it." The words hung in the space between them like fragile crystal, too delicate to touch. Grace looked at him, stunned into stillness, her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the counter, her breath coming faster. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered. You're still grieving. You miss her. You should miss her. Her voice cracked slightly on the last part. Julian stepped around the counter, the boys still blissfully distracted with sprinkles and sugar chaos. He came closer, close enough to see the sheen of hesitation and fear in Amelia's eyes. I do miss her, he admitted, his voice raw. I will always miss her, but that doesn't change what I feel when I look at you. Amelia turned her face away for a second, swallowing hard. You don't understand. I could never be what she was to them. I'm not her, Julian. I don't look like her. I didn't belong to this world. I still don't. Her voice was low but firm. What we have now, it's built on borrowed time. One day this will end, and I'll be just the help again. Julian's expression shifted, not to anger, but to a deep, resonant pain. You think I don't see you, Amelia? I see you more clearly than I've seen anyone in years. She shook her head, a single tear breaking free and tracing a path through the frosting on her cheek. I love those boys like they're my own. And maybe that's my mistake, because I can't promise I won't get hurt, or that they won't. This is dangerous. Julian reached out and gently brushed the tear from her cheek with his thumb, letting his hand linger for a beat too long. I'm not asking you to replace anyone, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. I'm not asking you to be her. I'm asking you to be Amelia, just Amelia, and that is more than enough. Amelia's lips parted, a silent response trembling on the edge. Her shoulders slowly relaxed, her gaze falling to the space between them. For a long moment, nothing was said, and yet everything had changed. Because in that moment, both of them stood unarmored, not boss and employee, not widower and caretaker, just two broken people willing to be whole again, together. She reached up and pressed her palm gently to his chest, as if to check if his heart still beat with sincerity. He closed his eyes, letting her touch anchor him. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Just then, a loud cheer broke the tension as Miles held up a cupcake with so many sprinkles it looked more like glitter than cake. Look, Mommy would love this one, he shouted, beaming with pride. Amelia and Julian turned in unison, their eyes landing on the boys, both of whom were now sporting frosting in their hair and on their cheeks. Leo held out a cupcake too, laughing. Taste it, Daddy. It's for you and Miss Amelia. They didn't understand the emotional magnitude of what had just unfolded. They didn't need to. Their joy was pure, untethered by history or hesitation. Julian leaned down and kissed the top of Leo's head. Looks perfect, buddy. Amelia wiped her face with the back of her sleeve and crouched down between the boys. Let's make one more for Mommy in heaven. Okay. The twins nodded solemnly, then went back to their chaos, giggling and bouncing. Julian watched them, then looked back at Amelia. She smiled, not the careful, polite smile of an employee, but something real, something that reached her soul. And this time, when he smiled back, it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like breathing. And in that kitchen, with sugar on the counter and laughter in the air, something unspoken finally became understood. The cupcakes were a mess. The kitchen was a disaster. And yet, there was nothing broken about this moment. William didn't need to overanalyze it. He didn't need to chase clarity. It was already there, in Amelia's eyes, in the way she returned to the twins and helped them place candles on the smallest cake. She didn't speak of their conversation again, and neither did he, not with words. But as she lit the candle and leaned in between the boys once more, Julian stepped closer, standing just behind her, his hand brushing hers as she guided Leo's grip on the lighter. Their closeness was natural now, no longer tentative. It wasn't just the boys who had found peace in her presence. It was him. And when the twins clapped with frosting-covered hands and cheered as if they'd just won a grand prize, Amelia turned her face toward Julian and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." Julian nodded, his voice low and certain. "I don't ever want to stop." The boys, oblivious to everything except joy, smeared more icing on each other's noses. Their laughter filled the kitchen again, but this time Julian laughed too, and so did Amelia, and for the first time, the room didn't just echo with life. It echoed with belonging. The garden had never looked like this before, not even during the years when it was meticulously manicured by professionals. Today, it wasn't the trimmed hedges or the blooming roses that made it feel sacred. It was the people. Leo and Miles stood proudly in miniature gray suits, their tiny hands tightly clasped around Amelia's. Their hair had been combed, their cheeks were pink with anticipation, and though they still wiggled in place like any 5-year-olds might, there was a solemnity in their expressions. They understood, at least in their own way, that this was an important day. Julian stood beside Amelia, not touching her yet, but so close that when their eyes met, it was as if no one else existed. The sun cast a golden light over them, but the real glow came from within. There were no violins, no officiant, no scripted vows. It wasn't a wedding, not yet, but it was a declaration, a promise, a way of telling the world that something sacred had happened inside these walls, not loud or public, but deeply, irrevocably real. Around them stood close friends, a few family members, and the staff who had once whispered in corners and now clapped with open affection. Julian cleared his throat as he faced the small gathering, visibly nervous but not uncertain. "I never imagined I'd be standing here like this," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "When Isabella died, I thought that part of my life, the part that laughed, that dreamed, that believed in mornings like this, died with her." He paused, glancing at the twins, then at Amelia. "But then someone walked into my home and, without asking for anything, gave everything. She didn't come here to change our lives. But she did. Not by replacing what was lost, but by reminding us we were still here, still alive, still worth loving." The crowd was silent, listening intently. He turned to face her directly. "Amelia Johnson, you walked into a house that had forgotten how to breathe, and you gave it back its heart. And today, in front of everyone who matters, I want to say what I should have said long ago." He reached for her hand. "You are not the help. You are the healing, and I hope one day I can call you my wife. But for now, let this moment be our first real beginning." Amelia blinked back tears, trying to stay composed, and gave the faintest nod before speaking, her voice quiet but firm. "You didn't have to say any of this. I knew it already," she whispered, then turned slightly toward the boys, who were now gripping the edge of her simple white dress. "But hearing it matters. Because I've never really belonged anywhere before, not like this." She looked back at Julian. "I didn't save this family alone. I found something here that saved me too. I found them." She motioned to Lau and Miles. "And I found you." She turned toward the small crowd. "I don't know how to be perfect. I don't know what tomorrow will look like. But I know how to love. And I promise I will never stop doing that." The guests exhaled a collective breath they'd all been holding. Then Leo, without a shred of hesitation, shouted, "She's our mama now!" His voice rang out, clear and bright, followed immediately by Miles's enthusiastic echo, "Yeah, our mama forever!" Laughter erupted, tender and joyful, and Amelia dropped to her knees as the twins barreled into her arms. She held them close, her face pressed into their hair, tears slipping freely down her cheeks. Not of pain, but of pure, unburdened release. Julian stepped behind her, placing both hands gently on her shoulders, grounding her in the moment. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Everything had been said. Around them, the murmurs of celebration grew, but in the center of it all was a perfect stillness, a calm born from truth finally spoken, and love finally, fully accepted. Isabella's portrait hadn't been taken down, nor had her presence been erased. Instead, she lingered in every memory, every whispered bedtime prayer, and Julian felt her now, in the wind that stirred gently across the garden. It wasn't a haunting. It was a blessing. He looked up briefly, and in his mind he imagined her smiling. Not jealous, not forgotten. Just free. And offering that same freedom to him. He tightened his grip on Amelia's shoulder briefly, a silent thank you sent toward the breeze, and then let go as she stood, still holding the boy's hands. "Let's take a picture," someone said. "The kind that families take, not for show, but for memory." They gathered close, unposed but perfect, and the shutter clicked. Later, as the guests slowly departed and the garden emptied out, Amelia remained with the twins by the small pond at the edge of the property. They were skipping stones, their suits wrinkled, their shoes already kicked off. Julian stood at a distance, not guarding, just observing, soaking in a kind of peace he had thought impossible only months ago. Amelia glanced back at him and gave a small wave. He walked over slowly, hands in his pockets, and crouched beside them. "They look happy," he said softly. "They are," Amelia replied. "So am I." Julian nodded. "Me too." The boys ran ahead, chasing each other now, their laughter echoing across the grass. Julian reached for Amelia's hand and laced their fingers together. "You were right," he said. "About love. It's not replacing, it's surviving." Amelia leaned her head against his shoulder. "No," she corrected gently. "It's more than that now. It's living." He kissed her temple, soft and certain. No more ghosts, no more guilt, just gratitude, just this. The day ended as it began, surrounded by sunlight, laughter, and the simple truth that had taken so long to find. Love didn't erase the past. It built something new and beautiful beside it. Amelia stood between the boys as they waved goodbye to the last guest. Julian joined them, resting a hand on each of their small shoulders. Together, as a family, not perfect, not traditional, but absolutely real, they walked back toward the mansion. The same mansion that had once been a tomb of memories was now a home again, a place of beginnings. And as the door closed behind them, it wasn't an ending at all. It was a vow. That joy would no longer be a visitor here. It would live in every corner, in every echo, because of one woman who loved without permission, and one man who dared to love again. We pour our hearts and souls into every story we bring to you, because these moments are created with you in mind. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something, or brought back a memory of your own, we'd be honored to hear from you in the comments. Your voice, your story, is truly part of what makes this space so special. If you'd like to support us and help more stories like this come to life, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Each video takes days of care, thought, and emotion to prepare, and your support is what keeps us going. Feel free to explore our other videos, too. There's a whole collection of stories waiting to be discovered. And please remember, every like, every comment, and every new subscriber is deeply and sincerely appreciated. Thank you for spending this time with us. We're grateful to have you here, and we hope to see you again in the next story.